Hello, everybody. It is fantastic to see such a great crowd in here tonight. I'm Kate Casey. I'm the faculty director of the King Center on Global Development. And for those of you who are new to the King Center, we are Stanford's research hub on all issues global development. By design, we have pitched a very large tent. It spans all of campus, so crosses all disciplinary boundaries, all school boundaries, department boundaries. And I think the idea is this will give us a platform to have an explicitly multidisciplinary approach to the challenges facing the global poor. So we do three main things. So we fund research. We also train the next generation of global scholars and leaders. And then we convene conversations like this one on critical topics in development. So it is my super pleasure to introduce Dean Karlan, who is our speaker tonight. Dean is a distinguished professor of economics and finance at Northwestern University, but that is just one of his many jobs and hats and roles in society. So he is also, of course, the chief economist at USAID at the moment. And he's a founder of a number of NGOs and social enterprises. And I want to point out one in particular, which is called Innovations for Poverty Action, so IPA. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is a global NGO. They have presences, long-standing presences in 20 countries around the world. And they've really created the infrastructure to enable people to collect data, randomized control trials in some pretty tough environments. And so this was set up, originally for their own projects, but became this platform that has been very empowering for all of us, myself included. And they've always explicitly wanted to make this open for junior scholars who don't have access to the resources that you kind of gain as you progress through your career. So Dean really inspires me and a lot of us in the room for his ability to, he's at the frontier of academic research. He's a wildly successful academic economist. But then he makes all these investments in society, in the sort of philanthropic space, and now he's serving in government. So I can think of no better person to lead this conversation on, what works and what doesn't in foreign aid and why it matters. So please join me in welcoming Dean Karlan.
Thank you, Kate, for the flattering introduction. And trust me, Kate and I are members of the Mutual Admiration Society. I will not be as eloquent, though, in waxing on. I want to share some thoughts that hopefully will come across as a cohesive set of thoughts, but they are a bit disparate in some ways, on the wonky fight against poverty. And this is the wonky fight. What I'm basically referring to is applying rigorous methods of both data and theory to help understand more about what works, what doesn't, and why, but then what are the obstacles for actually getting outside of our box in academia into policy to actually use those kinds of insights, not just for publishing papers, but for actually changing the way policies get implemented. So I'm going to talk first about that evidence to policy process and I'm going to start with just giving you three what I would call pain points, or you might also call them apologies of a recovering economist. And then I want to talk a bit about what I see as some of the obstacles for that evidence to policy process. And one thing I will say, just based on the introduction, I am here representing, I'm here with my hat as a professor, not here representing USAID. Of course, I'm happy to talk about the role of bilateral aid in general as a concept and practice. But when I talk about the obstacles here, I'm going to, I might use some examples that may or may not apply to USAID, but will apply, I think, more generally to any sort of large donor, bilateral donor in particular. And then we'll give you a very brief example of two efforts that I've been involved in as a researcher, and how they speak to this problem of aggregation of evidence to speak to policy. Okay, one overarching theme that I wanted to kind of set expectations a little bit lower than the advertised title of solving poverty through role of foreign aid. These are kind of fair and noble questions to ask questions about, like, does aid work? How do we make aid writ large at scale, like end poverty? I've always been a little bit cautious about the term ending poverty. In fact, one of my prouder moments at IPA was getting our vision statement for a while was more evidence, less poverty, not no poverty. Just out of recognition that if we said no poverty, we would never achieve our goal. And it sounds lofty and it's a bit more inspiring, but I do like to set realistic goals. It's part of why I don't claim to want to weigh only 160 pounds anymore. I would like to lose weight, but I know that's not happening. So the other issue, though, is it's a bit grandiose of a question, and I do admire the question, and I think there's a role for it, but at the end of the day, isn't the answer kind of obvious? It's going to depend. Some aid is going to work, some is not. Treating aid as a monolithic beast and asking the question, does aid work, is obviously going to be a byproduct of what that aid is in that particular place and that time. And so in a sense, what I'm going to share with you now, when we get to some of the actual studies that I'm talking about, is being a little bit less ambitious, but with that, asking smaller, but I would then say, like, they're still ambitious, but they're smaller questions. And I think the smaller questions, we actually have more chance of success in moving the needle on policy. Okay, here's my three apologies as an economist, or pain points. The first is about cost effectiveness analysis versus benefit cost analysis. And I realize we have a mixed crowd here. I will define these terms briefly. Second is, oh, look at that. They're all numbered number one. The second number one point is the catch-22 of external validity. Again, I'll define the term here, but there's this struggle that I think we face between what I would call going broad and going narrow when we think about research, and I'll explain there. This one is inevitable and unavoidable, and it's just a matter of accepting it and then recognizing that research at the end of the day, no one set of studies answers everything, and the world is really more of a mosaic, and we piece it together. And that's going to be kind of a punchline. The third is about mapping global evidence to local policy. So how do we go about taking evidence that might be really convincing from 4 different parts of the world, 10 different countries, things like this, and we go to a new country and we say, great, what is this evidence from over here, and how is it helping us over there? And this is, in a sense, a pain point, partly because of our process, but in a sense, if we don't think about it right, then it's a pain point. But if we think about it right, I think of this as a real opportunity. This is where we can really move the needle in improving our research, improving its applicability by thinking through that process more. So I'll explain that one. So that one's a little bit like an apology, but it's not actually. That one's actually one where I feel like we actually have, if we think about that more as an opportunity, not a pain point, we're in a good world. Okay, so the first pain point, cost effectiveness versus cost benefit analysis. I was actually not that aware of the importance of this distinction on a very practical level until I started working in government. Cost benefit analysis, for those not familiar, in short says, well, we have a cost of a program, it costs $100 million to reach, maybe you think about it as a per household basis. You're gonna do something that's gonna spend $1,000 a household. What are the benefits that accrue to that household in dollar terms? And that's the key, is you're putting it in dollar terms. So even if the benefit that is accruing to that household is about education, if it's about female power, if it's about reduced domestic violence, whatever it is, you're putting it into dollar terms, you're dividing, so you have a ratio of benefits to cost. That way, from a planner's perspective, you can actually then make trade-offs and say, okay, well, should I move money from education to health? Which one has a higher benefit cost ratio? The downside is you have to monetize every outcome and add it all together, right? But you have to monetize these things, and that can be tricky. Cost effectiveness says, no, whatever that outcome is that your unit, your policy, your government ministry, your donor, whatever the case is, you have an outcome you're trying to move the needle on. Maybe it's test scores for children. Maybe it is domestic violence. Maybe it is actually income for the household. Whatever that is, accept that as its unit, whatever. You don't have to convert it to dollars if it's not. And then you just ask, okay, of the 20 ways I have to try to improve primary school test scores, what's the most cost-effective way for every $100 I spend per child, which is going to move the needle most on test scores? And you don't have to convert that to dollars, right? So you miss out on the ability to compare across sectors. But the mistake that I think we make, at least that I've discovered, is cost benefits is a very antagonistic thing to talk to people about. If you go to someone who's dedicated to working in education and you say, we're going to do cost-benefit analysis, that's code for if things don't work out, I may take your toys away because health is going to beat you or ag is going to beat you if your benefit-cost ratio doesn't come out good enough. If, on the other hand, you say, what is your goal? Your goal is improving test scores for children? It's fine. I'm not passing judgment at all on that. I accept your goal for what it is. Now, how can we use the evidence that's out there to move the needle on the thing that you said you care about? All of a sudden, you're their friend. You're there to help them, and there's no antagonism. Antagonism? Did I say that right? So that's, I think, one of those things that economists often, it's our instinct to want to go to cost-benefit because of the nature of the theoretical underpinnings behind it, and there's a lot of merit for it from a philosophical perspective. But here's the other reality, is at least at most bilaterals, USAID included, but others as well, no one in that agency is making decisions across sectors. That, I assume, it's done by Congress, for the most part, which we can only assume is done by a bunch of senators and House reps sitting down with deep theoretical models of the world, optimizing that, and we can trust that they get that right? And so we accept those allocations as they have deemed optimal, and then our job is to allocate accordingly. And that's true of, I think, most bilaterals, or do not really actually sit down with an excess billion to say, what sector should we invest this in? That's just not the way it works. You do have that luxury at large private foundations, particularly family foundations, but for most part, that's not the decision that any government is making in a ministry. They're focused on education. That's their mantra. Okay. The second pain point I want to talk about is what I would refer to as the catch-22 of external validity. And here, when we're talking about external validity as an economist, what we're really talking about is the ability to go to a new place, take results from one place, and use them to make predictions about somewhere else. It's basically what we're talking about. And the idea is that we're doing that with some combination of evidence and theory about why something works, so that when you go to a new place, we know, well, what are the contextual factors that we need to know about in this new place in order to then be able to predict what's going to happen with a certain policy. And when you can make that prediction really well and with confidence, then we refer to something as having more external validity. So take two different ways of thinking about research. Suppose that you want to do training for entrepreneurs. And so you go to Ghana and you do a very large-scale study that's a randomized trial across lots and lots of small, medium enterprises throughout Ghana, and you have an average treatment effect of your training program. That training program includes lots of different things in it, so you don't really know why it works so well, but you did it across lots and lots and lots of small, medium enterprises across the entire country. If you then wanted to know, what do you think would be your best prediction next year for doing the same thing, or what would be your prediction for going to Niger, and I'm picking a country of kind of similar poverty, actually they're a little bit poorer, but let's assume there's similar poverty, same number of syllables, so we can think that there's lots of external validity to extrapolate to countries based on that. And you might say, okay, I don't know why it's working, but I feel comfortable that this thing, which was done at scale across a wide swath of society among a composition of SMEs that kind of looks a lot like this other place, I can have confidence to extrapolate and get a prediction that's going to be pretty good. Maybe it's even within Ghana, it's just 2 years later, same, so a lot is held constant, but it's Ghana 2 years later. That is, gives you that confidence, but you don't know why, right? You don't have a good story underlying. What's the other end of the spectrum is going what I would call narrow, which is to say, suppose instead what you say is, I have this theory about record keeping, and record keeping being a skill, a knowledge piece that could be really helpful for then improving the following 3 decisions that entrepreneurs can make. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to teach record keeping, but it's to this very specific type of industry, an entrepreneur with this level of human capital, and then I can find an impact or not. And when I find that, I have a nice, very tight theory about this very narrow situation, and I actually have a really good confidence that if I can go to entrepreneurs like that, in that industry, with that level of human capital, that I can generate the same thing again because I have this really tight theory. And so the point is, both of those are providing, in a sense, some external validity, but they're very different ways of going about it. and what we need in this, and we struggle with this when we are going to new context and we're trying to make predictions. And so sometimes we have studies that are doing the first, sometimes we have studies that are doing the second. And yet when we are thinking about translating evidence to policy, we need, we actually need both of those is the reality in order to make those good predictions. And so that requires a different kind of aggregation of evidence and understanding of how to synthesize those types of things. But this is a pain point which each one of those is going to be inevitably inspiring and frustrating at the same time in different dimensions. And the world I would like to see us in is a world in which we see both of those happening, right? We don't want all of one and none of the other. The third pain point, and this is the one that really is just an opportunity, which is the mapping of global evidence to local policy, if done right, actually then also articulates what are the local conditions that you need to understand and decisions you need to make to implement that policy. I'm going to give you two very concrete examples in a bit, so I'm not going to talk through this, but the real point here is that when anybody ever talks about using global evidence to inform local policy, nobody's ever, there's like this straw man that seems to be out there sometimes of people thinking that this is about kind of top-down programming, and that's not the way I actually have ever heard it take place. It's you have some broad evidence on something being effective. Cash transfers is an example I'm going to use, but that doesn't mean when you go into a country and you say, okay, great, let's implement cash transfers, that you don't have with you an accompanying set of 10 questions that you need to figure out about local context in order to know how to do cash transfers in that country to generate the kind of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish in that country. And so there's always this combination of using global evidence with then understanding, letting that global evidence inform you about what are the local questions that you need to understand, the institutional facts, the demographics, things of this nature, in order to then form local policy to implement a program with the comfort that it does have this kind of strong global evidentiary base. Okay, so what are the obstacles for it? So those are 3 pain points. So then what are the obstacles? So first of all, if only were that easy, I'm going to give you a list of a few that are on my mind. I have no idea the relative magnitudes of the things I'm about to name. And this is just my, in a sense, stream of consciousness of what are some of these obstacles. So I'm going to first talk about, I am a dorky economist, so I'm going to talk about it at a supply side, demand side, and then the nexus of the two. So the supply side, it's an us problem. Us being, I'm now putting on very clearly my researcher hat when I say us problem. So one is we have really bad synchronization of our data and our measurement and things like that. We can do a lot better. It's a difficult space because of you want to, at some level, have synchronization. So very, very pragmatic things like how do you measure income? How do you measure consumption? And having differences across studies makes it really hard to then understand what are the global lessons that you're learning. And at one level, you want synchronization, but you don't want to thwart innovation in measurement. So it's not, I don't have a perfect solution. I just know that we don't do this as well as we can. We definitely do not have enough meta-analysis as I would like to see in this world, which is one of the reasons why I took on this project that I'm going to share with you in a moment. We also see insufficient replication. Kate mentioned innovations for poverty action. That is like right there in the opening memo that I wrote to my grad school advisors, Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Sendhil Monathan way back when I was in grad school saying, hey, here's this kind of crazy idea, what do you think? And one of them was very much, who is going to do, here we are at that point, we were all embarking on different randomized trials, and my question was, who's going to do the second, third, fourth, or even the 5th to 10th? And yet no one thinks that we should be writing global policy based on one, and yet we need to see that replication in order to really get confidence. And so that was one of the motivations for starting Innovations for Poverty Action, and we are seeing that happen. The last is something which we just don't produce much of, which I would like to see, and I'll admit I haven't ever done this either, which is to produce an operational guide at the end of an academic paper reporting on the impact of a program and having an appendix that says, okay, are you going to actually now go do this? If so, here's an operational guide for all of the qualitative contextual stuff that was done in the setup of this study, of this intervention that you need to know and be thinking about as you go to some country and decide whether to do this or not. And we don't write those kinds of guides. We often just kind of assume the world figures that stuff out. And that would be nice. And I'd put myself in that list too. Okay, so what are the, on the demand side? So you kind of say I'm saying this is a them problem, but in reality you could easily put this right back on the researchers in the sense that we're the ones producing the evidence, then it's also on us, both of this. The first is, evidence does not care who pays for it, but yet that is very true of the way most donors behave, is they look at the evidence on things they funded as somehow more informative than things that other people funded. And I don't, that's, it's a little bit like something, it reminds me of a little bit like I learned something the other day, that if someone asks you which is your favorite child, you're supposed to name one of your own. So it's a good lesson to learn. But but in this case, like why would we care who pay? Like it's our evidence, your evidence. It should be, if it's objectively collected and produced and analyzed, we should be indifferent to it. That's not our nature. We pay more attention to our own evidence, and it shouldn't be. Bad data, bad analysis is often difficult to tease out. It's really easy to make bad things look good. And the fact is, there's a lot of misleading statistics out there. Believe it or not, there's some incentives from politicians to exacerbate that problem. There's also a risk tolerance problem. Learning from failure should be a win, but as we all are aware, it's not always the case. Now, we've seen the world change a lot in the sense of being willing to do randomized trials to measure impact, and there's a lot of organizations that do this, and the types of talks I would give have changed dramatically over 25 years, from first trying to inspire ones to do it to then being in a world where it's more commonplace. But it's still not as often as we would like. There's also principal agent and what I call training skills problem, which is a little bit like saying, what do voters respond to? So if the voters, the ones who are represented by the policymakers, are looking at bad data and bad analysis to guide their thinking, then you have a principal agent problem. Which is kind of similar to whether it's intentional because they're representing voters or not, is a similar issue if you just have policymakers who don't see the difference between correlation and causation, basically. So this is where this is one of my favorite little photographs to kind of make this point. If you looked at this, you look at the data, you see two people in the same exact position, and yet one of these is clearly causal and the other is not, and yet, that could be very misleading if you don't have an understanding of the theory as what's happening underneath here and the difference between correlation and causation. But there's something very instinctual, and in fact, many times I've been in conversations when I give a talk about, I'm not gonna get all wonky and talk about randomized trials here, but I've many times, I'll talk about research that comes out of them, but not the underlying reasons for them. But it's striking to me how often you give, I will sometimes be talking about the need for more understanding of treatment effects and causal impact, and someone will respond to me who's a policymaker or donor and say, I'm with you, this has been bothering me forever, but I really am adamant about always tracking outcomes from the people that are in recipients or programs that I'm funding, but without a counterfactual, without evidence of impact. And that's literally the exact opposite of what I'm saying. I'm like, no, that's a world in which I don't want to see you tracking outcomes. I just want to see you tracking outputs. And I want to see you using evidence from elsewhere that says that output causes a certain change in an outcome. But if you don't have a counterfactual, then you might be getting a completely wrong answer by just tracking what happens to people over time without knowing the causal story. So, okay, the nexus problem is that this is like call this the we problem, the two coming together. The first is, one of the nicest summaries I've ever heard of an entire discipline is the summary explanation of what is applied behavioral economics, is the science of making it easy. The longer version statement of that is making it easy for people to do the thing they would say they want to do in a moment of deep reflection and full information. But that's very much our mantra too, in the way I think about trying to shift the needle on policy, is how do we make it easy for the policymaker to have the right information at the right point in time for the decisions they need to make about where the evidence base is. And a lot of that is actually on the researchers. We don't produce the kind of outputs that are often needed, that are translated into that right decision-making moment and that right decision-making process. And for what it's worth, that at USAID, that is a big chunk of what we've been working on, is how to get that analysis done in the right way, speaking to the exact kinds of things that are needed by the people who are controlling how the money gets spent. A second part of this nexus is on iterative partnerships. That I think is about the nexus of demand and supply. And there's two different versions of this that I'm referring to. The first is operational research. There's a lot of research that we need to do where we need to lower our ambition on any one thing that we're learning. We need to do more tests on the equivalent of what color of the envelope works best for generating take-up of something. Right? And in a lot of contexts, there's an equivalence of that in a developing country context. Each one of those questions individually might not be very interesting, but collectively, if you can do a series of iterative work like that and then improve the implementation fidelity of a program, that can be really, that can lead to important insights that have a huge impact on policy. The second context in which I mean this about iterative partnerships, where we need to see more work to improve, is on partnerships with government. At the end of the day, even large bilaterals like USAID, FCDO in the UK, are tiny compared to local government money. So if more donor money can be used as basically to facilitate evidence partnerships with the government, where programs that are funded are not running in a silo off to the side of whatever government is doing, but they're actually integrated with government so that they are then speaking to the actual problems the government is facing, then a lot more impact can be generated from that kind of evidence generation. I'll give you a very simple example later in a bit. Okay, so the two examples now I'm going to talk through in a very, not in super detail. One is cash transfers, and the second is graduation, which is a social protection program. So this first one is a paper that we just recently posted. I won't go through all of this, but basically what we did is we did a meta-analysis of, there's been 114 papers written from randomized trials of providing people cash transfers, unconditionally, just here's cash, now let's find out what happens. It is probably the intervention that is the most common and the most studied with randomized trials. And yet and so that's a perfect example of where if you're going to try to decide whether to do cash transfers as a policy, there's a lot of evidence to turn to from the world to understand what is this doing, what is it generating. And you shouldn't be looking at one study from one place in one country in one point in time to form that evidence, that decision from a policy perspective. So we did this analysis putting these together. It's 114 studies from 73 different programs. And we basically are using this both to answer the big picture question of just, okay, fine, what are the average treatment effects? In a fairly atheoretical way, how much does it move the needle on assets, income, consumption? So if you want to just think about it as, how does that generate a change in food security compared to handing someone food, you can make that comparison with the analysis we've done. We also are asking some more theoretical questions about what we can learn about households with some of the analysis. By having that many studies, we can actually start comparing results across studies in ways that shed some insight. So for instance, I'm not going to go through all this list, I'll just cherry pick a couple to give highlights. Two choices that you often face if you're going to do cash transfers. One is you give all the money up front, or do you give money in a stream a month at a time? And the kind of canonical thinking is that if you give the money up front as a lump sum, more of it will get invested and less consumed. And if you give it as a stream, more will get consumed and less invested. So that does indicate that if you give it as a lump sum, you might see treatment effects last longer. That's the theory. The truth is somewhere not that extreme. You do see that difference. In the long run, it actually doesn't seem to matter which way it is done. We find very, very few differences in the long run between the two, which does indicate a little bit more ability to move money around. Another question that I'll skip to the fourth one on targeting women. A lot of programs will target women with the idea that they will then use that money more for health and schooling and things of that for the children. We do find strong support that more of the money when it's given to the women is leading to those kinds of outcomes. One of the most important results in here too is a lack of a negative result. One of the fears that people often have of cash transfers is that, but if you give people cash, won't they stop working? And the answer is exactly the opposite. Over and over and over again in developing countries, when you relax someone's cash liquidity constraints, you give them money, they work more, they invest more, They have more freedom. And that's consistently found over and over and over again. So the fear is literally getting it exactly wrong. And the reasoning is, I think, pretty straightforward, which is the problem with for a lot of times the problem with being poor is the fact that you can't make those investments because you don't have those resources. And so if you relax the constraints of the resource constraint a little bit, you allow people to both have the mental energy and the capital to make investments. So how do you go back to the third pain point? How do we contextualize this? So if you're going to take cash transfers and go to a country and say, great, so obviously there's more details under what I just said, but let's just say you take the punchline of that work and you say, great, cash transfers are good, and I can on average expect a 36% increase in consumption for these transfers. So what do you do in a country to actually roll it out? This is that third pain point about how do you contextualize, how do you use local information to then design the program? Well, there's all sorts of decisions you have to make, and you're going to have to go talk to local institutions and understand local markets and preferences and constraints. So first of all, are you going to give it out money mobile, to a bank account, physically in cash? What is the timing? Well, what is the problem you're trying to address? If you're trying to address investment in farming, well, then obviously you should be giving out the money timed along those lines. If you want to give it out for a school so that the money is used for schooling, then maybe you should time it for that way. If you want to give people choices over when to receive it, then you need some way of having people choose when they're going to get the money. If you are thinking about it as a way of building resilience and helping households absorb shocks, well, then you need to think about whether you give money in anticipation of a bad thing happening or as relief if the bad thing happens. These are all very pragmatic decisions that you have to make, and they depend on what the local need is, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and then getting local institutional facts down in order to make these kinds of decisions. I'm not going to go through each of these, but these are just an example of the kind of what I would call contextualization or localization that needs to take place when you take global evidence and you say, great, now what are we going to do here about this? So the other example I want to share with you is, in the sense sometimes we call this the cash plus model. Sometimes we refer to a cash plus model would be like providing a cash transfer plus maybe a small training program that adds 10% or 20% cost to the program. So it's like a cash program with a planning exercise to help the household think about how to plan the spending of that cash. So the graduation model I would call a cash plus model because it's more like cash plus twice as much money or 100% or 100, it's a lot more money. But it's providing savings, it's providing training, it's providing life coaching, sometimes for 2 to 3 years, usually 2 years past the cash transfers. And so there's a lot more involved in it, but it's a more holistic attempt at addressing issues of ultra poverty. And so it has this kind of collection of interventions that are all part of this theory of this program is that if you have that the problem with poverty is not any one thing, and so you need to try to address multiple problems at once in order to help the household build sustainable source of income for years to come. And so we tested, seen this tested in 8 sites, actually more now, but the original sites were 8. 6 of these we published together in Science about 9 years ago. Yemen we implemented at the same time, but was delayed because of the civil war. Bangladesh was tested prior by other researchers, and across all 8 of these we're getting fairly similar results. This shows you the average treatment effects at 2 years and 3 years. And so the idea here is to see, do results persist from 2 to 3 years, which is basically a big part of the theory of this program, was about lasting longer, because 2 years versus 3, this is 2 years after they received the cash transfer. So that's the idea, is to see persistence. And the main takeaway I want to leave you with here is just showing you, ignoring savings for a second, you'll see that changed a lot, but most of these numbers are roughly the same. There was really no change. They from 2 years to 3 years. So they had a big it worked at 2 years, and by 3 years we're seeing the same basic effect. We've now seen 7 and 10 year studies from a few sites. This is pooling 6 of the sites together in what I'm sharing with you here. When we see the 7 and 10 year study, we see a mix. We see in India, we see a location where the treatment effects got bigger and bigger and bigger and amplified over time. Ethiopia and Ghana, we're seeing positive long-run effects at 7 years, but a little bit of a dissipation. But again, this is a great example of, sure, nice global evidence, consistent results in many parts of the world. That's just the results that I pulled together from 6. There's been about 15 more similar studies, randomized trials of the same basic design program, and very consistently finding positive results. Not every single time, but very consistent positive results. But this is a program which definitely doesn't like give you a pure recipe of like go to a new country and how to do it. So what are the kinds of things you have to decide there? Well, part of the program requires savings, promoting savings. How are you going to promote savings? Is it going to be an informal savings group, a bank account, a mobile money? These are all the kinds of things that need to be worked out to think about how to contextualize that program, which might be different in different parts of the country too. On the livelihoods, what is going to be promoted? When that technical training is provided, it was beekeeping in Ethiopia, it was guinea pigs in Peru, it was goats in Ghana, different livelihoods in different parts of the world. How do you choose those? Well, that needs to be, you need to have good partners that understand local markets, understand the risks and returns of the different types of investments in order to build that into the program. So even in something like this, even though there's this like really nice global evidentiary base, that doesn't give you a recipe for just immediately going and implementing. It gives you a recipe of questions to ask in the countries to know how to do that. And it doesn't take that long, 3 to 6 months, and you can kind of figure those things out and then plan and scale. The last two things I want to share are on improving this iterative model. So there's lots of exciting opportunities to do this, and I think in the world of administrative data, we're seeing more and more windows for this kind of iterative work, and we do need to see more of that. Okay. At the end of an RCT, we should be asking questions like, what is the operating design decisions that were made but that weren't tested? What went into that design, that design process? There were a lot of things that were probably vetted out as someone was designing and thinking through that. Those might be designs that are actually needed in the next site where someone is going to take that lesson and implement it, but because of their local context, they maybe would have done it differently. And that's, so it's important to understand what are those decisions that are getting made. And that's not something that we typically write about in academia. We would just write up the paper as it was done. We don't sit there and do this like long description of the piloting process and the ideation part of figuring out the mechanics of what the implementation was going to be. So I think we'd like to see more of that. I don't know where it fits within our papers because it's not going to fit in the main papers, but more appendices and things like that help do that translation so that when someone picks up that paper, they have some deeper understanding about what they need to think about in order to implement something like that. Okay, so concluding thoughts, basically. So on us researchers, the things that I think we need to improve this space, we do need more replication, more methods work on synchronization of data and methods for collecting data and measurement and like granular things like how we measure various concepts in the world across different sites. And if we want to then be able to aggregate up evidence, it's very difficult to do that when everyone's measuring things differently. And then with that, if we have better synchronization, we can do better meta-analysis and also more operational research. And what we need less of is enthusiasm for any one paper. On policymakers, we also need less enthusiasm for any one paper, but we need more reliance on other people's evidence, risk tolerance for measuring impact, recognition that trade-offs are real. One of the things that I've seen in many contexts, this is true at USAID as well as other donors and other large programs and even some government programs, is that it's very easy to imagine having a brainstorming process where you have a large budget and you are thinking about what to do to improve outcomes in schools. And you have 10 people around the room, all good, knowledgeable people, and everyone brings an idea to the table, and every one of those ideas is good relative to not doing anything at all. The reality is, though, those 10 ideas cannot all be good relative to each other if they're all trying to address the same problem. And that's not always as easy to do, is to help, and that's why I like cost-effectiveness analysis, because it does recognize if they're all trying to address the same problem, move the needle on the same, primary school test scores, then we should be able to compare them against each other, and we should then not be probably doing all 10. But if everything is instead a kind of, you're not facing those trade-offs and you're not thinking about that way, it's like it's almost as if you think aid money is like the magic bullet that shot Kennedy, that you think you can just refire consistently and keep doing it. You can't. The dollar only goes, can only be spent once. And so that recognition, I think, is actually going to go a long way to helping to crystallize and sharpen the thinking of policymakers and large donors to actually simplify, in a lot of cases, activities and programs that are being run in order to think about what is the key program that is actually driving the most that is possible to move with the dollars at hand. And with that also is a public good investment in knowledge. There's an ideal database. I should know the acronym. I'm part of the consortium leads. But it's a database of results from randomized trials, and we're putting this together collaboratively with the World Bank, SIGA over at Berkeley and Northwestern. And this, we hope, will actually help a lot towards facilitating. It's not going to automate meta-analysis, but it can make it much easier for individuals to do it. And we need more investments of that nature to help facilitate that knowledge and that aggregation and meta-analysis. So I will thank you very much, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a kind of a big picture question. So part of what you were mapping out in some of your side comments are really how this broad movement towards evidence-based policy has changed over time. So you were one of the early pioneers at the frontier, and you're sort of talking, you used to be explaining what is a randomized controlled trial, why is it a good thing to do, and now you're fast forwarding to today, and it's like, how do we coordinate across these 74 randomized controlled trials all on the same topic, and to repackage that for government. In terms of influencing the way foreign aid is allocated and donor decisions, where do you see the status of that broader movement? Like, where is it really getting good traction and success? And where is it just very limited in terms of changing the way governments and bilaterals, multilaterals spend money?
So, no, thanks for the question. And I don't know that I have a deep answer, but I think, so first of all, we definitely have seen the world change a lot in the sense that, 25 years ago, we were often needing to kind of pitch and sell the idea, why even do this? And then as this caught on, then it was more of it, both IPA and JPAL took on more of an intake process of people coming to IPA and JPAL saying, okay, great, we want to do that. And so we haven't been though good still about the aggregation. So I don't think that, we've seen progress. I think one of the problems that we do face is this recognition that, of course, the aggregation problem is plagued by the fact that, of course, there's heterogeneity. Everybody recognizes this. Most individual studies are not sufficiently large to test for heterogeneity. Mm-hmm. And so my hope is that we can make some, breakthroughs there in having better understanding of heterogeneity. For those who are not economists, when I say heterogeneity, what I'm really referring to is heterogeneity differences on two levels, that some things will just work better in some sites versus others for reasons that are about that site. It's about the implementer, about the country, about the context. Or also it could just be about heterogeneity within, that no, this just works better for blue-haired people and this works better for short people, or more realistically, maybe it's working better for people who are more educated or have stronger or weaker mental health, things like this. And so understanding what those drivers are for why things work, and that is actually really critical. And we're now getting to that world more, and we're seeing lots of exciting work, both from econometricians with new tools, as well as more ability to do that aggregation. So I think that's a world that we're, I think seeing just tons of exciting work on that can help. Now, where we've seen the inroads to the second half of what you're asking that I think is most, that in a sense it kind of, I think makes sense a bit. Like we see more inroads in the areas where randomized trials actually are really more intuitive and easier to do. Mm-hmm. Like education is a good example. Right. Like you can, it's a much more natural setting to do randomized trials. And so likewise, we've seen a lot more of them in education than a lot of areas. It's actually where Michael Kramer got his start doing randomized trials, was actually on education questions. And he was kind of the pioneers. He was the first kind of getting started with that. So things that are in the human capital and service delivery at the household level is definitely the area where we've seen more progress. Cash transfers is another example of one. And the ones where we see less are the ones where where the unit of intervention is harder, it's at a higher level. It's about firm policy, it's about roads, things like this. And, and that's harder to get clean evidence like that. So that in a sense that I think that's healthy.
Right.
Right.
Can I ask you just share a little bit, so more synchronization, more of these kind of cross-country studies. So maybe some of the lowest hanging fruit, like cash transfers, is pretty well covered. So when you're thinking of the target selection process for going forward, like how do you think about the types of interventions that are ripe for these types of collaborations? And particularly for the graduation program, can you speak a little bit about how that arose? Because I know you had been accumulating evidence on microfinance alone, and that was good, but it wasn't transformative. So let's try this, and then you have all these different teams working together. So just give us the background on that.
Sure. So like you referred to, in my early career, I was doing a lot of work in microcredit, and microcredit, had a lot of fanfare. The early randomized trials that came out, in fact, the very first randomized trial that I tried to do was in grad school. It failed. We never got.
We celebrate failure here.
Yep. But eventually, I did manage to do some, and others have as well. And the consistent evidence on the microcredit was a lot of meh on average, but actually some good positive results, and actually some of the aggregation work that came out after our first results, where if you just look at them in a superficial way, you think meh. Rachel Meager has some really nice work that puts them all together and says, actually, no, there's some really good right tails going on here. So there is, but the point is, we're mostly disappointed from a humanitarian addressing poverty issue. And the for-profits, I think, were rightly fairly pleased because we were not seeing too many evidence of harm. And so they were feeling very energized for saying, like, hey, so we can expand people's choices and make the world a better place in that way, and make money while we're at it. So that worked, but it left the poverty alleviation crowd unsatisfied, and I include myself in that. I actually got a call one day out of the blue. Actually, this person's become a very dear friend. I just went to his 80th birthday party yesterday in the coast of New Hampshire, saying, hey, there's this program called the Graduation Model. We've seen preliminary evidence from Bangladesh that looks good. What I really want to do is fund 8 more of these. Splatter across the world, cover different continents. Let's get a preponderance of evidence. And actually, the way he first proposed it to me, he didn't say the 8. He just said 1. And I just thought about it, and I was like, this program is going to cost $1,000 a household. Of course it's going to work. The question, will it actually be cost effective? Is it like at $1,000? I know I felt comfortable the point estimate will be positive. But is it really scalable? Is that really movable to policy? And so my first reaction was actually no. And then he said, okay, but I want to do 8 of these. And I was like, okay, now we're talking. And now I'm interested, because that was very much, a sore point as far as I was concerned, that we didn't have that kind of replication and that kind of iteration that was needed across sites. And so then we talked more, and he's become, like I said, a very dear friend. He was at Ford Foundation at the time. He was an academic who then went to Ford. Right. So I actually, he's the one that thought of doing it. Right. I mean, I had been talking about doing it, but I hadn't done it. So I think that's why he called me. But it was having that replication. And then it turns out, too, that from a policy perspective, I'm really glad to say I was wrong. That the treatment effects were big enough, and it doesn't have to cost $1,000 a household. There are ways of trying to do it cheaper, and that's part of what we're seeing a lot of really good work now on how to get that model to be cheaper. And the treatment effects are big enough and last long enough to pass most metrics. And so we're actually now seeing it folded into government policy and social protection. So I'm glad that I'm glad to say I was wrong on that one.
Okay, great. I want to just collect a few questions from the audience. We'll collect some, and then we'll turn it over to Dean to share some thoughts. Does anyone raise your hand? We've got people running around with mics. There's one right there. And there's one there, yeah. Just tell us your name and what's your affiliation to.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ihe. I'm a junior economics student and Latin American Studies minor. Thank you so much for your talk. I really learned a lot about how RCTs should work, and also it's very impressive to learn about your RCT project, which is seems like the ultimate version of RCTs that development economics should do. So my question is, what is the scale of the time and money and the effort that your group of researchers put into this RCT program, which is across different countries across the world and seems very big scale?
You're right. Let's just collect because we're gonna run short on time, and I want to make sure we get a few voices on the floor. There's someone right here, and there's someone in the back, and someone right there.
Please, my name is Isaac Doku. I'm a SIGA fellow from Ghana. Prof, that was a nice presentation, and I really enjoyed it. But I'm thinking, in all the problems you mentioned, I don't know. Currently, I am beginning to think that poverty is being also the one thing that is behind it is climate change, like diseases, climate diseases. Students may not go to school because schools are closed because of climate change. All aspects of our lives now, climate change is beginning to diversify the way we do things. But most of the projects, I don't really even see issues related to climate change. But it's all, okay, cash transfer, okay, students go to school, cash transfer, take this, and under 5 mortality. But how are we embedding climate change in all these policies as we go forward?
Okay, we'll take one last question. There's one right there.
Thank you for sharing. I'm Linda. I'm part of the business school down the road. When I think about RCT frees an intervention in time and tracks the effect of it over time. But if we think about tech-based solutions, whether that's an app or software, that may require update every day, every few weeks, every few months, the solution is inherently iterative, whereas the RCT freezes that intervention in time. What is your perspective on balancing these two tensions, where the research requires interventions to stay the same, but intervention itself wants to evolve rapidly?
So you've got 5 minutes to expound.
All good. So on the first, it was actually fairly cheap because we didn't do those studies. That was, when I say 114 studies, those were done by other people. All we did is download their papers, take the point estimates from papers, and create a database out of it. So that took some time and took some undergrad help and labor and double entry and triple entry and double checking, and papers aren't clear about what they're doing, and so you spend lots of time. So it wasn't like a free exercise, but it was not nearly like what I think you were thinking. We did not go and do that. The graduation program, that one was bespoke. Like we did go and do, and as part of that original paper, 6 randomized trials, and that's what Frank DiGiovanni, the person I mentioned, funded from Ford Foundation. I don't know what the total budget was, but it was in the millions across all sites. The climate change. I don't know if this is right or not, but I have the following conjecture, and I would love to see some concrete analysis to kind of see if this is right. But my intuition and gut is that there's a reason that most of us here in this room, no offense if this does not fit for you, my apologies, not too worried about climate change for our own sake. Like we're gonna be okay. Why? Because we're wealthy here. All things roughly equal. I mean, I realize that's not entirely true. I'm not trying to be callous, but there's a certain level of wealth that will allow us to absorb that shock. Right? We might be worried because we care about humanity. We care about other people. We care about our children, our children's children, things like that. But why? Why is that? It's because we have resources. So put this now to a developing country context, low-income context, and the punchline is, I'm not sure that our policies for adaptation need to be all that different than they were without climate change, where our goal is just to improve the wealth and stable income sources for the world's poor. And with that comes adaptation to climate change, and the ability to absorb shocks, and with that also comes the ability to do lots of other things and absorb all sorts of other shocks, pandemic shocks and everything else. It's not so obvious to me that our policy should always be different. Now that might be wrong. I would love to see a better understanding of what that ability is to absorb shocks, what those shocks are from climate change, and if they're so fundamentally different. But I think in a lot of contexts, we attach climate change adaptation as a rhetoric on top of something that the underlying policy that's optimal would be exactly the same if our goal was just addressing issues of poverty. On the app, I have two thoughts on your question about the app. One is, one thing that I think is often a common misunderstanding is that randomized trials can be over iterative processes. One can set up, and actually Kate has done awesome work on this with community-driven development, right? Where that's not a static intervention. That's going into communities, leading a community through community-driven development, randomizing over communities, but you don't control what's happening in each community, and you get to study the impact. So it's, in a sense, that can be the process. You can say, we're going to roll out this app, we're going to iterate it, and we're going to evaluate that process with that app as it iterates with individuals. So that might be true depending on the app and what the problem is you're solving, where that's actually part of what you want to test is this iterative process, and we're going to set it up where some people get that app and allows it to iterate and other people don't, and you see the treatment effect. The other answer is that, as with most things, if that's not applicable to the problem in the app that you're thinking about, I think there's just a natural process of, like, when something is still in its tinkering phase and you're still figuring out, like, the beta phase, then no, that's too early. You don't do a randomized trial yet. Figure it out, get it through that process, get it to a point that you're ready to scale it, and then that core thing, it doesn't say that you can't, like, still iterate and figure out how to perfect it, but you at least got it to a point that you're ready to scale it, and then that's a point that you could then say, no, now it's appropriate to do a randomized trial as a decision point to decide whether to scale it. So you're past the tinkering, and then you're into that phase.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but thank you all so much for being here. Please come to other King Center events. Dean, you've given us a lot to think about and talk about, so feel free to hang around and have some more conversations. But please join me in thanking Dean.
Thank you.